There is a particular kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with sleep. You have probably felt it. That end-of-day heaviness where you look back at 8 or 9 hours and struggle to identify a single thing of real consequence that you actually accomplished. The calendar was full. The inbox was active. The messages kept coming, and you kept responding. By every visible measure, you were working. And yet something feels hollow about it. Something feels borrowed, spent, used up. Without the satisfaction that should follow genuine effort. That feeling has a name, though most people never learn it. It is the feeling of having been busy without ever having been focused. And the gap between those two states, between the appearance of productivity and the reality of it, is where most careers quietly plateau, where most ambitions slowly dissolve, and where most intelligent people spend their entire professional lives without ever understanding why they never quite reached what they were capable of. Here is the assumption worth challenging immediately. We have been taught in subtle and not so subtle ways that effort is the currency of success. Work harder, put in the hours, outwork the competition. This idea is so deeply embedded in American professional culture that questioning it feels almost dangerous, like suggesting that gravity might be optional. But consider what the assumption actually asks you to believe, that the person who sends 200 emails a day is twice as productive as the person who sends 100, that the executive in back-to-back meetings for 12 hours is achieving more than the one who blocks 4 hours of uninterrupted thinking time. That motion and progress are the same thing. They are not. And the most successful people alive, the ones quietly compounding advantages while everyone else is reacting, understand something that takes most people decades to learn, if they learn it at all. Attention is not a byproduct of effort. It is the raw material from which all meaningful output is made. And unlike time, which refreshes every 24 hours with mechanical indifference, attention is something far more fragile, far more finite, and far more precious than almost anyone treats it. Think about the last time you were truly, completely absorbed in something. Not multitasking, not half listening while checking a notification. Genuinely locked in, where the work felt almost effortless, where ideas connected in ways they normally don't, where an hour passed and felt like 15 minutes. Psychologists have a term for that state. Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, the Hungarian-American psychologist who spent decades studying peak human performance, called it flow. And what his research revealed was not simply that flow felt good, though it does, but that the cognitive output produced in that state is qualitatively different from anything produced outside of it. Problems get solved. Patterns become visible. Work that would take 3 distracted hours can happen in 45 focused minutes. The uncomfortable implication of that finding is this. If flow is real, and if the output it produces is genuinely superior, then every interruption, every context switch, every notification, every unnecessary meeting is not just an inconvenience. It is a direct tax on the quality of your thinking. It is a withdrawal from something that, unlike money, does not earn interest while you sleep. What makes this especially worth sitting with is that the modern professional environment has been, almost accidentally, almost by design, optimized to make focused attention nearly impossible. Open offices that prioritize visibility over concentration. Communication tools built around the expectation of instant response. Cultures that reward presence in meetings over quality of thought. Performance reviews that measure activity metrics. Every one of these structures sends the same quiet message: being seen working matters more than the depth of what you produce while working. And so people adapt. They become extraordinarily skilled at appearing productive, at managing the perception of busyness, at filling every available moment with some form of activity that signals engagement. Meanwhile, the work that actually requires depth, the thinking, the strategizing, the creating, the synthesizing, gets pushed to the margins, gets done in stolen moments, gets done tired, distracted, and fragmented. The people who break from this pattern, who build careers that seem to compound in ways others find almost unfair, are not necessarily smarter. They are not always more talented. What they have, often without being able to fully articulate it, is a different relationship with their own attention. They have recognized somewhere along the way that focus is not a habit to be developed. It is a resource to be protected. It is a vault, and most people are leaving it wide open. The question worth carrying into everything that follows is a simple one. What would your work actually look like? What would your thinking actually produce if you treated your attention with the same seriousness that a serious investor treats capital? Not casually, not reactively, but deliberately, strategically, and with a clear understanding of what it costs when it is spent carelessly. That question is where this journey begins. There is the experiment that neuroscientists have referenced for years, not because it is dramatic, but because its implications are quietly devastating. Participants were asked to make a series of decisions, trivial ones mostly: what to eat, what to wear, which option to select from a menu of choices. The decisions themselves were inconsequential, but as the session continued, something measurable happened to the quality of the participants' thinking. Later decisions were worse. Not slightly worse, meaningfully, demonstrably worse. The ability to reason carefully, to weigh trade-offs, to resist the easiest available option deteriorated in direct proportion to the number of decisions that had come before it. The researchers called it decision fatigue, and what it revealed was something that cuts against one of the most cherished beliefs in professional culture: the idea that a disciplined mind can simply push through, that if you care enough, if you are motivated enough, if the stakes are high enough, you can summon focus and clear judgment on demand, regardless of what came before it. The research said otherwise. The mind, it turns out, operates less like a muscle that strengthens under continuous load and more like a battery, one that drains with use, that cannot be willed back to full capacity, and that, when depleted, begins making decisions that the fully charged version would find embarrassing. This is worth pausing on, because most high-achieving people have spent years building an identity around their ability to push through, to outwork the fatigue, to perform under pressure. And that identity is not entirely wrong. There is real value in resilience, in tolerating discomfort, in maintaining standards when conditions are difficult. But there is a critical difference between tolerating discomfort and ignoring depletion. One is mental toughness. The other is cognitive self-sabotage dressed up as discipline. The neuroscience here is worth understanding in its basic shape, even without a laboratory. The prefrontal cortex, the region of the brain most associated with complex reasoning, long-term planning, impulse control, and nuanced judgment, is metabolically expensive. It consumes glucose at a disproportionate rate when engaged in demanding cognitive work. And critically, it is also the region most sensitive to depletion. When cognitive resources run low, the brain does not shut down evenly. It begins routing decisions through faster, less sophisticated pathways, the regions associated with habit, impulse, and pattern recognition. This is efficient in a survival context. In a professional one, it produces exactly the kind of thinking you would least want applied to your most important problems. Here is where it connects to attention specifically. Every distraction, every interruption, every context switch, every moment of fragmented focus does not simply steal the seconds it occupies. Research by Gloria Mark at the University of California, Irvine found that after a significant interruption, it takes an average of 23 minutes for a person to fully return to the task they were engaged in. 23 minutes. Not because people are lazy or undisciplined, because the cognitive state required for deep work, the particular configuration of working memory, background processing, and directed attention that makes complex thinking possible, takes time to rebuild. It cannot be snapped back into place like a light switch. What this means in practical terms is worth calculating, even roughly. If you experience 6 meaningful interruptions across a workday, which in most open-plan offices or notification-saturated environments is a conservative estimate, you are not losing 6 interruptions worth of time. You are potentially losing the conditions for deep thinking almost entirely. The surface of the day fills with activity. The depth never forms. And this is precisely why the distinction between busyness and focus is not merely philosophical. It is neurological. The brain you bring to a problem at 9 in the morning, rested, uninterrupted, with cognitive resources intact, is a genuinely different instrument than the brain you bring to that same problem at 3 in the afternoon after 6 hours of reactive communication and context switching. not metaphorically different. Chemically, functionally different. The insights available to the first version of you are not available to the second, no matter how much that second version wants them to be. What the highest output thinkers throughout history seemed to understand intuitively, long before the neuroscience existed to explain it, was that peak cognitive performance is a time-limited daily resource. Charles Darwin worked for roughly 4 hours a day in focused bursts and spent the rest of his time walking, resting, and thinking loosely. Charles Dickens wrote intensely in the mornings and considered his creative work done by early afternoon. Maya Angelou rented a hotel room specifically to remove herself from the stimulation of her normal environment. These were not indulgences. They were, in retrospect, sophisticated resource management strategies, built on an instinctive recognition that the vault had limits. The question that naturally follows is not simply how to avoid depletion. It is something more architectural. If focused attention is finite, if it degrades predictably, if it cannot be summoned at will once spent, then the real leverage is not in pushing harder within the existing structure. It is in redesigning the structure itself. That is where the most interesting answers live. In 1905, a 26-year-old patent clerk in Bern, Switzerland, produced 4 scientific papers in a single year. Any one of them would have been considered a remarkable lifetime achievement. Together, they reshaped the foundations of modern physics. The year is remembered in science as the annus mirabilis, the miracle year, and the instinct when hearing that is to reach for an explanation rooted in genius. To conclude that Albert Einstein simply thought at a level the rest of us cannot access, and that his output was the natural expression of an extraordinary mind operating at full capacity. But that explanation, while comfortable, misses something more instructive. Einstein's working environment at the patent office was, by the standards of academic science, almost absurdly simple. He reviewed technical documents for a fixed number of hours. The work was concrete and finite. His evenings and margins were his own, unscheduled, undemanded, protected from the social and institutional pressures that consumed his contemporaries in university positions. He was not networking, he was not attending committees, he was not managing the perception of productivity within a competitive academic hierarchy. He was thinking, deeply, continuously, and without interruption, in whatever time remained after his obligations were met. This is not a story about working less. It is a story about what becomes possible when the conditions for deep thinking are deliberately protected rather than accidentally hoped for. And when you look across the careers of people who have produced genuinely outsized intellectual and creative output, not just success by conventional metrics, but work that compounded over time and changed something, a pattern emerges that is surprisingly consistent. They did not simply work hard. They engineered their environments. The distinction matters enormously. Working hard within a poorly designed environment is like trying to fill a bucket that has holes in it. The effort is real. The intention is genuine. The result is frustrating and inexplicable to the person experiencing it, because they can feel how much they are putting in and cannot understand why so little is coming out. Engineering the environment, by contrast, means identifying where the holes are and closing them before the water goes in. What does that look like in practice? It begins with an honest accounting of something most professionals never consciously examine: the architecture of their own day. Not the calendar as it is scheduled, but the attention as it is actually spent. If you were to track, hour by hour, the cognitive state you occupied throughout a typical workday, truly focused, partially focused, reactive, socially engaged, mentally idle, what would that map reveal? For most people, even highly successful ones, the answer is sobering. Genuine deep focus, the kind that produces original thinking, complex problem-solving, and high-quality output, occupies a surprisingly small fraction of the working day, often less than 90 minutes in total, sometimes less than that. The highest output performers throughout business history did not necessarily have more of those minutes available to them. What they had was a clearer understanding of which minutes those were, and an almost fierce commitment to protecting them from everything else. Darwin's 4 hours were not randomly distributed through his day. They were the first hours when cognitive resources were freshest and the world had not yet made its demands. Toni Morrison wrote before dawn, before her children woke, before the day organized itself around other people's needs. Warren Buffett has described his daily schedule in terms that would strike most executives as almost provocatively unstructured. Long stretches of reading and thinking, with meetings and calls occupying far less time than his peers might expect. What these examples share is not a specific routine that can be imported wholesale into another life. What they share is a philosophy, a prior commitment to protecting the conditions in which their best thinking could occur, rather than fitting thinking into whatever space remained after everything else had been accommodated. There is a concept in architecture called defensive design, the practice of building spaces that naturally guide behavior in intended directions, without requiring constant conscious effort from the people within them. The best attention architectures work the same way. They do not rely on willpower to resist distraction. They remove the distraction from the environment before willpower becomes necessary. They do not ask the person to be disciplined enough to ignore notifications. They eliminate the notifications during protected hours. They do not ask the person to resist the pull of reactive communication. They restructure the day so that reactive communication occupies its own defined space, separate from the hours designated for deep work. This is a fundamentally different orientation than the one most productivity advice operates from. Most productivity advice is remedial. It assumes a broken environment and offers techniques for coping with it. The architectural approach is preventive. It asks a different question entirely. Not how do I focus despite my environment, but what would my environment look like if it were built from the ground up to produce focused output as its natural result? The people who ask that second question, and then actually answer it with their calendars, their spaces, their communication norms, and their daily structures, tend to produce work that looks, to outside observers, almost inexplicably good. The explanation is not mystery. It is architecture. And architecture, unlike talent, is something that can be deliberately built. But there is a variable in this equation that even the most thoughtfully designed environment cannot fully account for. One that lives not in the physical space around you, but in the social one. There is a particular kind of meeting that most professionals know intimately, even if they have never named it precisely. It is the meeting that had no clear purpose when it was scheduled, produces no clear outcome while it is happening, and leaves everyone in the room slightly more depleted than they were before it began. The calendar describes it as a check-in, a sync, a standing call. What it actually is, in cognitive terms, is a scheduled withdrawal from everyone's attention vault, one that recurs weekly, sometimes daily, with the cheerful automaticity of a subscription nobody remembers signing up for. But that meeting is only the most visible version of a phenomenon that operates at a much subtler level throughout professional life. The deeper truth, one that makes genuinely high-performing people protective in ways that can occasionally read as cold or inaccessible, is that other people are among the most significant consumers of focused cognitive energy that exist. Not because people are problems to be avoided, but because human social interaction, even when it is positive, even when it is welcome, draws on the same finite reservoir that deep thinking requires. This is not immediately intuitive. We tend to think of social engagement as separate from cognitive work, as something that happens in the spaces between thinking rather than something that competes with it. But the brain does not experience that separation. Social processing is metabolically expensive. Reading a room, managing the impression you are making, tracking the emotional subtext of a conversation, deciding what to say and what to withhold, calibrating your communication to the particular person in front of you. These are all sophisticated cognitive operations. They draw on the prefrontal cortex with the same hungry efficiency as complex problem-solving, which means that a morning spent in dense social interaction, even pleasant, productive social interaction, can leave you cognitively in the same place as a morning spent on demanding analytical work. The vault has been drawn from. The balance is lower. The implication that most people resist is this. Managing your social exposure is not antisocial behavior. It is cognitive hygiene. The executive who blocks 2 hours each morning and holds calls until the afternoon is not being difficult. They are being strategic about the sequencing of cognitive demands. The writer who does not check messages until noon is not being precious. They are protecting the neurological conditions under which original thinking is possible. The entrepreneur who declines certain networking events is not failing to build relationships. They may simply have recognized that the cognitive cost of those events exceeds what they are prepared to spend from that particular reserve. What makes this genuinely complex is that not all social interaction drains at the same rate. This is where the distinction becomes more nuanced and ultimately more useful. There is a category of human interaction that does not deplete, that actually seems to restore. Conversations with people who challenge your thinking in productive ways. Collaboration with someone whose mind works differently enough from yours to generate genuine surprise. Deep, unhurried dialogue with someone you trust, where the social performance layer drops and actual thinking happens between two people rather than in parallel. These interactions feel different because they are different, neurologically. They are generative rather than merely consumptive. The drain, when it comes, tends to arrive from a different category entirely. Interactions defined by obligation rather than value. Conversations that require you to manage someone else's emotions without generating insight. Meetings structured around the appearance of alignment rather than its substance. Social environments where the primary cognitive demand is not thinking but performing. Performing engagement, performing enthusiasm, performing agreement, performing presence. These are the interactions that leave professionals staring at their screens at 4 in the afternoon, wondering where the day went and why they feel incapable of producing anything worthwhile. Howard Hughes, whatever his considerable personal difficulties, understood something about cognitive isolation that his peers did not. John D. Rockefeller was described by those close to him as almost unnervingly deliberate about where he directed his social energy, generous in some directions, immovable in others. More recently, Bill Gates famously instituted what he called think weeks, periods of complete social withdrawal during which he read, thought, and allowed his mind to work without the constant interruption of organizational life. These were not retreats from responsibility. They were, by Gates's own account, among the most productive periods of his working year. The decisions and directions that emerged from those weeks shaped one of the most consequential technology companies in history. The pattern across all of these examples is not misanthropy. It is discernment, a conscious, deliberate distinction between the social interactions that serve the work and the ones that consume the resources the work requires. And that discernment, it turns out, is itself a learnable skill, one that begins not with rejection, but with honest observation, with starting to notice, without judgment, which interactions leave you more capable and which leave you less so, which relationships add cognitive energy to your reserves and which subtract from them, which obligations, when you examine them honestly, are worth what they cost. Because here is what the most cognitively productive people seem to understand that others do not. Your attention is not just a professional resource, it is a relational one. How you spend it, who receives it, in what quantities, under what conditions, is one of the most consequential decisions you make, repeated dozens of times each day, almost entirely without conscious awareness. And those decisions, it turns out, say something. Something that the people around you are reading, whether you intend them to or not. There is something that happens when a genuinely senior person enters a room. Not senior in title necessarily, but senior in the way that registers before anyone has checked a business card. The room reorganizes itself, subtly and almost instantly. Conversations shift, postures adjust, people become slightly more deliberate about what they say and how they say it. And the person at the center of this reorganization is often doing very little to cause it. They are not performing authority, they are not commanding attention. In many cases, they are simply, and this is the part worth examining closely, very selectively giving theirs. Attention, it turns out, is one of the most powerful status signals that exists in professional and social environments. Not money, not title, not the visible markers of success that most people spend enormous energy accumulating and displaying. Attention, specifically the controlled and deliberate direction of focused regard, communicates something about a person that the brain registers almost before conscious thought catches up. It communicates that they have something worth protecting, that their cognitive resources are not freely available to whoever makes a claim on them, that their presence when it is given means something, precisely because it is not given indiscriminately. This dynamic has deep evolutionary roots. In social hierarchies throughout human history, the direction of attention has always tracked with power. The person who must constantly attend to others, who must monitor the room, respond to every signal, remain perpetually available, is, at a structural level, in a subordinate position. The person who others attend to, who can afford to be selectively present, who does not scramble to fill every silence or respond to every demand, occupies a different position entirely. We read these signals constantly, automatically, and with a sophistication that most of us never consciously examine. The executive who checks their phone during your presentation is sending a message. So is the one who does not. What makes this particularly interesting in the context of professional influence is that it operates in both directions simultaneously. The way you direct your attention shapes how others perceive you, and the way you protect your attention shapes what you are actually capable of producing. These are not separate benefits. They are the same behavior producing two compounding returns at once. When you are genuinely selective about where your focus goes, you become both more effective and more respected. The status signal and the cognitive benefit arrive together as natural consequences of the same underlying discipline. Consider how this plays out in meeting rooms specifically, environments where attention dynamics are especially visible and especially consequential. The person who arrives having clearly thought deeply about the matter at hand, who speaks less frequently but with more precision, who does not feel compelled to fill silence with noise. That person carries a different weight in the conversation than the one who has been reactive and scattered all morning and is now performing engagement while mentally still elsewhere. The difference is not always about intelligence. It is about what state each person's attention is in, and what that state communicates about how seriously they take the work. There is a concept in communication research sometimes described as the scarcity principle of presence. It operates on the same basic logic as economic scarcity. Things that are rare are perceived as more valuable than things that are abundant. Attention that is given freely and constantly becomes, in the minds of those receiving it, something expected rather than something earned. It loses its signal value. But attention that is clearly protected, that is not reflexively available, that must in some sense be deserved. That attention, when it arrives, carries genuine weight. People remember it. They respond to it differently. They organize their own behavior around the possibility of receiving it. This is why the most influential communicators are rarely the most verbally active ones. It is why the leaders who speak least in meetings are often the ones whose words carry the most. It is why a response that arrives after genuine reflection tends to be trusted more than one that arrives instantly. In each case, the signal being received is the same. This person's attention is not automatic, which means when it is present, it is meaningful. The practical implication of this extends well beyond meeting rooms. It applies to email response times and what they communicate about your priorities. It applies to which requests you accept and which you decline, and what that pattern reveals about your understanding of your own value. It applies to the quality of presence you bring to conversations, whether the person across from you feels genuinely attended to or merely tolerated. And it applies to the reputation that accumulates over time from thousands of small attention decisions that others observe and interpret even when you are unaware of being observed. Warren Buffett has said in various forms that the difference between successful people and very successful people is that very successful people say no to almost everything. The common interpretation of that observation focuses on time management, but there is a deeper reading available. What the most successful people are protecting when they decline is not merely their schedule. It is the quality of cognitive presence they can bring to the things they say yes to. They are protecting the signal value of their attention, ensuring that when it arrives full, focused, and worth something. Because attention, spent carelessly, does not just diminish the work, it diminishes the person doing the work. And the people in the room, the ones reading you constantly, registering every signal you send about what you value, they notice. Every vault has a combination, a specific personal sequence that opens it, and an equally specific understanding of what belongs inside and what does not. The metaphor is worth taking seriously because what separates the people who talk about protecting their attention from the ones who actually do it is precisely this. The second group has built something concrete, not a philosophy, not an intention, a system, one with actual structure, actual boundaries, and actual consequences for violations. They have done the architectural work, and that work, it turns out, is both more accessible and more demanding than most people expect. The first element of any serious attention architecture is what might be called a cognitive audit, not a time audit, which is what most productivity frameworks begin with. A cognitive audit is different in a crucial way. It asks not where your hours go, but where your mental sharpness goes and in what sequence. For 1 week, without trying to change anything, simply observe. Notice when your thinking feels genuinely clear, when connections form easily, when problems yield, when words or ideas arrive without friction. Notice equally when the opposite is true, when you are pushing through fog, when decisions feel laborious, when you read the same paragraph 3 times without it landing. Map those states against what preceded them. What you will almost certainly discover is a pattern more reliable than you expected and more actionable than any generic advice about morning routines. Because the goal is not to adopt someone else's system, it is to understand your own cognitive rhythm well enough to build around it. Some people do their best thinking in the first 2 hours after waking. Others need 40 minutes of low-demand activity before the mind fully opens. Some find that physical movement, a walk, a run, something that engages the body without taxing the prefrontal cortex, reliably produces a window of clarity that follows it. The specific pattern matters less than the commitment to identifying yours and then treating it as non-negotiable. This is your primary deposit window, the hours when the vault is most full and the withdrawal rate is highest. Everything else in the day should, where possible, be organized around protecting that window rather than colonizing it. The second element is what serious practitioners sometimes call a distraction pre-commitment. The research on willpower is fairly consistent on one point. Using it is expensive and the supply is limited, which means that a system built on the expectation of resisting distraction in the moment is a fragile one. It will hold on good days and collapse on the ones when you most need it. The more durable approach is to make the distraction unavailable before the moment of temptation arrives. This means structuring the environment so that the default behavior, the path of least resistance, is also the behavior that protects focus. Notifications off, not silenced. Communication platforms closed, not minimized. Physical space arranged to signal deep work, not to invite interruption. These are small structural decisions that compound quietly over time into something that looks, from the outside, like extraordinary discipline, but is actually something more reliable than discipline. It is design. The third element involves what you might think of as attention rationing, a conscious, pre-decided allocation of cognitive resources across the categories of work that define your professional life. Not all work is equal in what it demands or what it returns. There is work that requires your sharpest thinking, the problems that only you can solve, the decisions that will have long tails, the creative and strategic output that defines your actual contribution. And there is work that is necessary but cognitively cheap, administrative tasks, routine communication, logistical coordination. The rationing principle is simple in concept and genuinely difficult in practice. The first category gets your best hours, and the second category gets what remains, not the reverse, which is what most professional environments, left unmanaged, will naturally produce. The fourth element is recovery, and this is the one that ambitious people most consistently undervalue because it looks, on the surface, like doing nothing. But the neuroscience is clear enough on this point to be worth taking seriously. The brain consolidates learning, processes complex information, and restores depleted cognitive resources, not during work, but during rest. specifically during the kind of rest that involves low external stimulation. Walking without a podcast, sitting without a screen, allowing the mind to move without directing it. The default mode network, which activates during these periods of unstructured mental wandering, is associated with some of the most sophisticated cognitive processing the brain performs. Integration of disparate ideas, long-range pattern recognition, the sudden arrival of solutions to problems that resisted direct assault. What most people call doing nothing is, in neurological terms, some of the most important work the mind does. Scheduling it is not laziness. It is maintenance of the instrument. The fifth and perhaps most personally demanding element is the ongoing practice of selective presence, the daily, sometimes hourly decision about which claims on your attention are worth honoring and which are not. This is where the system meets human reality with all its complexity and friction. Because the people making claims on your attention are not abstractions. They are colleagues, managers, clients, friends, family members, people whose needs are real and whose relationships matter. The skill here is not indifference. It is discernment refined over time into something that feels, eventually, less like a decision and more like a standard. A quiet internal clarity about what deserves your full cognitive presence and what can be handled with less. What all five elements share is a common underlying principle, one that the entire arc of this conversation has been building toward. Attention is not managed reactively. It is governed proactively. The vault does not protect itself. It requires intention, architecture, and the kind of ongoing commitment that most people extend to their finances or their physical health, but rarely to the cognitive resource that underlies both. The people who understand this, who have genuinely internalized it rather than simply found it interesting, tend to move through their professional lives with a quality that others find both admirable and slightly hard to define. They seem less reactive, less scattered, more capable of the kind of sustained high-quality output that compounds over years into something that looks, from a distance, like exceptional talent. And perhaps some of it is talent. But most of it, on close examination, turns out to be something far more democratic than talent. It is the decision, made daily, remade constantly, never quite finished, to treat your attention as the most finite and most valuable resource you possess, not as a background condition of your work, as the foundation of it, as the vault from which everything else is drawn, and which, tended carefully, never quite runs dry. Word count, 981. There is a particular kind of clarity that arrives not at the beginning of learning something, but somewhere in the middle of having lived with it. The ideas explored across these pages are not complicated in their essence. Attention is finite. Distraction is expensive. Environment shapes output more than willpower does. Other people draw from the same reserves that deep work requires. Focus, when protected, becomes both a performance advantage and a signal of professional seriousness. And the vault, whatever form yours takes, can be built, tended, and drawn from with intention rather than desperation. None of this requires a dramatic reinvention of how you work. It begins, as most durable change does, with a shift in how you see. Once you start perceiving your attention as a resource with real limits and real value, the decisions that follow tend to organize themselves. The meeting that served no one becomes easier to decline. The morning that was being surrendered to reactive communication becomes something worth defending. The work that deserved your sharpest thinking begins gradually to receive it. The vault is yours. What you place inside it, and what you allow to drain it, is among the most consequential series of choices you will make. Not in a single dramatic moment, but in the ordinary, repeated, quietly decisive moments of every working day.